So, one thing that I've noticed is that when looking at the way that political issues are framed, not necessarily the way that they actually are in the real world in terms of their outcomes, but the way in which they're framed theoretically to appeal to different camps of voters or different political ideologies, is that essentially in cases where you have a left right issue, but where the right wing is more of the like libertarian individualist type, as you often have, especially in places like the United States and Canada. The libertarian position is always the one that benefits the individual in terms of how it's framed, whereas the left liberal socialist position is generally the one that is framed as benefiting the society as a whole. And I find that very interesting. It's sort of like the idea of the prisoner's dilemma or tragedy of the commons. This idea that what is good for the individual, like what is best for the individual, often conflicts with what is actually best for society as a whole. And the libertarian or right wing side will generally support, in theory, what is best for the individual, whereas the left socialist side will support what is best for society as a whole. Now, the thing with this is obviously it's flawed because sometimes each political camp uses these ideas to manipulate their voters. And in reality, the opposite may be true. Like, for instance, in the case of the big thing that happened in 2020, I'm avoiding referencing it by name because I don't want to get censored because YouTube censors people a lot on this particular topic. But the big thing that happened in 2020 that originated in Asia, the different responses to that big thing were predicated along these lines of the prisoner's dilemma or tragedy of the commons, with the right libertarian side supporting what they viewed as individual freedom, the freedom to not be bound by certain restrictions and regulations, whereas the left-wing side supported what they viewed as being for the common good, like this idea of protecting public health. Now, what ended up actually happening, and I will fully admit I fell victim to this because in my thinking, as I guess I would define myself as sort of a right wing, a conservative socialist. So I am sort of more toward the left socialist style of thinking in regards to tragedy of the commons or prisoner's dilemma, where I ultimately think what benefits the whole is more important than what benefits the individual. However, I will concede I was manipulated because they framed it in this way successfully, but in reality, the situation was that these restrictions and regulations that were imposed did more to hurt the collective than help it. So I would say that's an example of where that framing is used, but it was actually used in a very incorrect way, in a way that didn't reflect the reality of this situation. Another example where things are framed in that way is immigration, because I would argue that the consequences of immigration are actually negative for society as a whole. But again, like a lot of the right frames it in terms of like, well, immigration, it's going to hurt things for me, for my family. Like, and that's the thing. When I talk about the individual, I'm also including the nuclear family as sort of an extension of the individual, because a lot of these right libertarians, they think in terms of like what is good for their immediate nuclear family, but they don't think in terms of the community or the society as a whole. So again, like this is a case where it's framed in that way, but in reality, I think immigration as it currently stands is a net negative for society as a whole, in terms of its cultural impact, in terms of like the dissolution of cultural identity, and things of that nature. And also in terms of its impact on certain aspects of economics, like workers' rights. I don't think it's good for workers' rights at all. It's very bad for workers' rights, in fact. But yeah, overall, okay, again, it's kind of framed that way, whereas left liberals see it as being for the greater good. It's like, oh, we're helping more people by doing this, by bringing them to our country and improving their quality of life. But they're not considering it from the perspective of like, yeah, but if you drag your own country down, if you poke holes in the lifeboat, there's no lifeboat left. So that's kind of how I would see it. Plus, I guess I see things differently in terms of what the collective is compared to leftists, because they tend to view it in terms of the whole planet, whereas I tend to view it more in terms of like my civilization being Western civilization, which would include basically Europe, North America, Australia, New Zealand. I suppose also it would include Siberia, the European descended population in South Africa, and to some extent would include the European descended population in Latin America, specifically the Southern Cone, although whatever. Like, that's beside the point. Okay, but my point is, largely speaking, I would define the collective maybe differently than they would. However, that being said, even then, I do think there are certain things where you have to take it into account globally simply because certain things do not respect national borders, like air pollution, environmental trends, things like this don't necessarily respect national borders. So you kind of have to think of it on a global scale to some extent. But anyway, I digress. My point is, when looking at it issue by issue, there does tend to be this trend of right-wing libertarians. Like, unfortunately, in Canada and the US, the discourse is largely between right-wing libertarians and left-wing socialists, or at least not necessarily socialists per se, but like more socialist than the right. Like, they're not full-on socialists, they're more liberals. But the point is, it does leave out my side of the spectrum, my quadrant, which is the right-wing socialist quadrant, the conservative, socially conservative, economically somewhat more socialist leaning, although not hardline socialist. But yeah, it leaves out that entire perspective. But not only that, it's also, keep in mind, people can be very hypocritical, because a lot of liberals claim to stand for one thing, but then their actual behaviors contradict it. Like, for instance, you see a lot of liberals driving SUVs, which blatantly goes against their alleged stance on issues like this. And I'll get to that in a moment, because I'm about to list off the issues where you really see this this dichotomy manifest itself. So the first one is taxes, because with the case of taxes, you have a case where it's like your society will be benefited in some ways by having higher taxes, especially on the rich and the upper middle class, because it will result in better services, better quality of life in some ways, things that contribute toward your community, like public transit, healthcare, education, etc., parks and recreational facilities, preservation of historic architecture, things like that. But the issue is, yeah, okay, some tax money is typically lost to corruption, waste, government bureaucracy. I don't doubt that. However, I would counter it by saying a lot of money is lost to that in the private sector also. And the private sector just typically doesn't do as good a job with certain things because they're just not profitable. So that's why, again, libertarian approaches don't necessarily work when it comes to things like healthcare, public transit, architectural preservation, parks, and other recreational facilities, things like that. Like, there's a lot of areas where the libertarian approach, the private market approach, it's been tried and it just doesn't seem to work as well. So that's an area where, again, like, I do think there is a prisoner's dilemma aspect, because it's like the individual, the nuclear family, in some way loses out by paying more taxes. However, the society, the community as a whole benefits. So I do think that is a case of that. Another case is the environment, climate change. Now, obviously, some people get around it by just believing that it doesn't exist. But nonetheless, if you do accept the premise that it exists, then there is a prisoner's dilemma to it, because there's this idea that, like, by being allowed to pollute as much as you want, it may benefit you as an individual or as a a family unit, but it hurts society as a whole on the community, nation, global level. Now, obviously, it does hurt you as an individual too, but that's the thing. It's like, fundamentally in all these cases, doing the selfish thing will, it'll help you as an individual, but it does hurt you as an individual when everyone does it. And that's kind of the fundamental dilemma here. And I'm not trying to claim that I'm not guilty of this. I think everyone's guilty of this, regardless of where they fall on the political spectrum. Everybody's guilty of doing selfish things that they know hurt society as a whole, but help them as an individual. But yeah, climate change is another one. Another one arguably is the issue of gun rights, because, I mean, it really depends on your perspective, because I've seen varying reports on whether having more guns in society results in a higher crime rate or a lower crime rate. Because on one hand, the US has a lot of guns and it has a high crime rate by first world standards. On the other hand, I believe Switzerland, Finland, and Austria also have a lot of guns and their crime rates aren't that high. Now, people do point to demographics as a cause for the US's high crime rate, but I would somewhat argue against that by saying, well, what about France? Because I've been to France a few times, and they're definitely a pretty enriched country by first world standards. They do have a lot of vibrancy, but their crime rate is not that high compared to that in the US, especially for murder. Murder is by far the crime where the US crime rate dwarfs other first world countries. So it does raise the question, like, is gun ownership a prisoner's dilemma issue, where it's like being allowed to own a gun makes you safer, perhaps, as an individual or as a family, but having so many guns in society makes it more dangerous for everyone. It may or may not, again, because it's like there's counter arguments too. Like, one counter argument I've seen is that, like, maybe it increases murder rates, but it could actually decrease burglary rates having more guns. I'm not sure on that one, because it's harder to find statistics on crimes like burglary from other countries to compare to the US. Like, murder rate statistics are a lot easier to find. So that one, I'm a little bit agnostic on what, like, it's an issue in general that I'm agnostic on, like gun rights. I haven't really fully decided one way or the other, because I have seen conflicting evidence both ways. But my point is, it is kind of an issue like that. Another issue a bit like that is abortion, although it could be framed in multiple ways. But I've seen some hypocrisy from conservatives who are against. It's actually bizarrely a case of right-wingers taking the collectivist side for once, but being hypocritical with it, because they'll say that, like, abortion's bad for society as a whole, but then if their own daughter gets pregnant and the father's a deadbeat, they will allow her to get an abortion. I don't know. Is that actually something that often happens, or is that just a trope that liberals use to mock conservatives? I don't actually know. But I'm saying, in theory, that could be framed as like a prisoner's dilemma issue, where the right wing, although this would be like where it's all flipped, actually. So yeah, I'm not sure exactly how abortion would apply to this. So maybe not. But anyway, yeah, that might not be the best example, but there's other examples I have that I'm thinking of too. A huge one actually is sex. The idea of hypergamy, promiscuity versus monogamy, because many people have called monogamy sexual socialism, and it's actually true. And this would actually be an area where the left kind of are more on the individualist side, so things are flipped, where basically monogamy is good for the society as a whole, but allowing promiscuity is good for a minority of high status males, basically chads. So like kind of the 80-20 rule, like 20% of the men getting 80% of the sex. So that would definitely be a prisoner's dilemma issue, because you'd have some men, a minority of men, for these men, the chads, it is a prisoner's dilemma issue, because they are personally benefiting from a situation that leaves the majority of men unhappy. Not just the majority of men, but arguably leaves women unhappy too. Well, actually, I think not arguably, because there's plenty of statistics showing that like women with more sexual partners tend to be more depressed, and also that the sexual liberation has not raised happiness rates among women, but has actually done the reverse. So I would argue that, yeah, the sex is definitely a prisoner's dilemma issue, but bizarrely you had the left more so advocating for like promiscuity and hypergamy, whereas the right, the conservatives, are more arguing in favor of monogamy or sexual socialism. So that's an issue where things are actually flipped a little bit. Another example of this would be architecture. Like having a lot of traditional architecture is good for the society as a whole, for the community you live in. It makes it more beautiful. However, on an individual level, there may be certain benefits to living in a modernist building. Like a lot of traditional buildings don't have air conditioning, and if they do, it's expensive to install. It's not impossible, and it's not unfeasible, and I think it could be done in a lot more situations than it's currently being done. But nonetheless, I will concede there are certain expenses, there are certain obstacles to living in a historic building. And yeah, that would be an example of a prisoner's dilemma issue to some extent, where it's like, um, it's kind of like what they say about the Montparnasse Tower in Paris. It has the most beautiful view in the city because you can't view the Montparnasse Tower from there. It's like living in the one modernist building in a historic old town would be great for the person living there because you can't see your own building. But it's like, it's bad for everyone else because they can fucking see it and it ruins the view of the entire town. So that would definitely be an example of a prisoner's dilemma issue. This would be more debatable in terms of where the left and right would fall on this issue, like who is more in favor of stricter historical preservation laws. But that would definitely be a prisoner's dilemma issue in its own way. And I think on a related note, the entire issue of suburbia sort of is a prisoner's dilemma issue. Now this is one where the right is more in favor of the individualist idea, because it's like with suburbia, not just for environmental reasons, but for other reasons. It's like, as an individual, as a family, you get a bigger house, a bigger yard, but there's a loss in terms of the feeling of community that exists where you live. Like it's not as walkable. There's not as much street life. There's not as many like independent restaurants, or just as much of a sense of like community and being in an actual place where people, that, you know what I mean? Like when you go to like some of these old towns in Europe, or even places like old Quebec City, it feels more like an actual place. There's a sense of place there. Whereas the suburbs, they feel very dead, very blah, very lifeless. But the difference is like this idea that like, oh, but in the suburbs, you get more as an individual, as a family, you get a bigger house, a bigger yard. So, and when you look at what suburbanites say to justify why they think suburbia is superior, it very much focuses around the individual. Whereas when you look at new urbanists, like advocates of walkable communities, when they talk about what's superior about their approach, it very much focuses around the community, around the collective. So there's definitely a strong prisoner's dilemma aspect to the whole suburbia versus walkable communities debate. And it does, I mean, on average, I would say, yeah, the right libertarians do tend to be pro-suburbia, whereas the left liberals are more pro-walkable communities. Although, again, this is one where I notice plenty of hypocrisy in the real world, or perhaps just, I think a lot of the like people who sort of vote liberal or vote Democrat but aren't particularly ideological might be like that, where it's like they're suburbanites but they vote left. So it's like they're kind of hypocritical, but they're also kind of a bit ignorant, because I think they're just not necessarily aware that this is a political issue. It's also that, frankly, the left-wing political parties don't actually advocate that much on this issue, which is, of course, very interesting, because it's like they know that this is an issue where they would piss off a lot of powerful people in the real estate industry, in the automotive industry, and just their voters, by actually taking any real steps to promote more walkable communities and less funding, less emphasis on suburbia. So again, like, I mean, there's some hypocrisy there for sure, but it's also the fact that this is an issue where maybe the pandering to the individualist side of the debate is so strong that even the left-wing parties openly support that side. They just support it slightly less aggressively than the right-wing so-called conservative parties do. Another example along similar lines is the whole issue with SUVs, pickup trucks, and vehicle size. Because again, like, this idea, like, you get a vehicle that's safer supposedly for you as an individual and the people who are riding in your vehicle, but it makes it less safe for other motorists and for especially pedestrians and cyclists, which is proven because death rates among pedestrians have been steadily rising since the SUV and pickup craze really started taking off. And it is because of that, largely, because these vehicles do tend to be more deadly to pedestrians. So there's that aspect. There's also the aspect of other ways in which these vehicles harm the community, environmental impact, as I've already mentioned, and resource depletion, which is another prisoner's dilemma issue as a whole, like resource depletion for similar reasons to the environment. And also just the fact that, like, they negate urban planning that's more community oriented because these huge vehicles, they demand big parking spaces, wide streets, and things like that, which are antithetical to the idea of walkable communities. So all that, yeah, vehicle size is definitely one. Now another issue, which is kind of a more complicated one, but interesting, that does go along these lines, is over tourism. And I admit I'm guilty of this one because I do travel to a lot of places, but this idea that, like, you being able to travel somewhere benefits you, but the sheer number of tourists in at least some of these destinations overwhelms the local community, the local environment, and has a negative impact. Plus, there's the environmental impact, at least if people are flying or driving. Now, if they're taking trains to these tourist destinations, as many people do in Europe, the environmental impact is minimal. But nonetheless, yes, flying and driving do have major negative impacts. Now, the issue where over-tourism becomes complicated along the prisoner's dilemma lines is that a lot of people, they're actually traveling for the sake of, like, being able to participate in, go to places that have that sense of community that they're actually lacking at home. So it's really odd because it's like, in some sense, they're doing something that's community oriented by participating in these, by wanting to go to these places, like in the case of, like, people traveling to historic cities and towns in Europe and places like that. But on the other hand, you can argue that their presence there does have a negative impact on these places, because when they become too touristy, the local culture can suffer somewhat and get pushed out, especially in the cases of, like, Airbnbs displacing local residents and things like that. So that, I think, would be another prisoner's dilemma issue. Another one, now this is one I have to be careful in talking about because it's another topic that I think YouTube censors on, but choices of a romantic partner. Let's just say there are certain choices that people can make in terms of who they may partner with. And this could be interpreted in multiple contexts, but let's just say there are certain choices. Well, I already sort of covered this with the whole hypergamy thing with the Chads and the 80-20 rule, but it's also true in other aspects as well. Like, there are certain externalities to people's life choices in terms of, you know, who they marry, who they have kids with or adopt kids with or whatever, along multiple lines, be they racial or gender or what have you. And when looking at the externalities of these issues, yeah, it is a prisoner's dilemma issue to a point. And it's actually one where, again, the left and right rules can be flip-flopped to some extent, where the left is all about individual freedom in these regards, and the right is more about, well, at least the far right. I mean, the mainstream right has really conceded on these issues, but the far right is more in terms of, like, what benefits the collective. Although, again, there's hypocrisy among the far right. There's heavy hypocrisy among the far right on these issues because there's the well-known issues of alt-right people, let's say, choosing partners, romantic and sexual partners, that would not fall in line with what they claim to advocate for society. This is a very well-known problem. So there's plenty of hypocrisy there, and there's also just bullshit logic used to justify it, like the conquistador argument for why it's okay for if you're male but not if you're female. It's bullshit. But I mean, look at the end result of what the conquistadors did on a continental scale. But yeah, I mean, that is another issue along those lines for sure. Another issue like this is buying local versus buying from mega chains, whether in restaurants or retail or anything else, because it is kind of a prisoner's dilemma issue. And I do notice right libertarians are always advocating buying from the mega chains, whereas left wingers may be at least somewhat more inclined to support local businesses, although they can be inconsistent on that. They definitely were not standing up for local businesses during the thing in 2020. They were actually scapegoating local businesses for the spread of the thing. But nonetheless, there does seem to be a bit of that whole dichotomy going on with this issue, because a lot of right libertarians do say, hey, go buy your shit at Walmart, support Walmart. Walmart is good. Walmart is the result of the free market. Also, it's like there is this element, because it's like, yes, you will benefit as an individual from lower prices at these mega chains, but you lose out as a community because the money doesn't stay in the community from these mega chains. Not only that, but there's not as much of a feeling of local identity, of local culture, when all the stores are mega chains. It just everywhere feels the same, and you do lose that sense of community, whereas like things like local restaurants, local bars and pubs give much of a greater feeling of local identity and culture. So that's definitely a prisoner's dilemma issue in its own way. And I would say, sadly, it is one where a lot of the right libertarians obviously are going to side with the mega corporations. They always do. And that's what makes it challenging, because it's more the right socialists who talk about it from the opposite side. But the libertarians will always side with the megacorps, which is very sad, but that's how they are. Another issue like this is the issue of smoking indoors and in other crowded public places like bus stops or train stations. Right libertarians always are advocating for people's right to light up and smoke cigarettes, or maybe even weed or crack, depending on how hardline a libertarian they are, in indoor public places or crowded public places that may or may not be indoors, like bus stops or train stations or whatever. Whereas it tends to be more the left socialists who were leading the crusade to restrict smoking. Now, again, there's some hypocrisy there, because the left was sort of more pro-weed, although that gets blurry along political lines, because there's a lot of libertarians who are also pro-weed, but then there's conservatives who are anti-weed. So it gets a bit blurry along political lines, but I do think there is an individualist versus collectivist debate going on in this issue that does stem from the same lines of thinking. I benefit from my freedom to smoke indoors. Actually, you don't benefit, because you're giving yourself like fucking health issues by smoking cigarettes, and you shouldn't. But nonetheless, they think they're benefiting, but they do acknowledge that it makes it more of an inconvenience for everyone else, because it's like, hey, if you don't smoke yourself, do you really want to be breathing in that shit? Of course not. Nobody enjoys breathing in that shit. So there's that. Overpopulation and resource depletion, other issues like that, they kind of tie in to the environmental issue, but they tie into other issues too. They actually tie into the issue of over-tourism, as I already mentioned, but also the loss of land, the loss of animal habitats, of ecosystems, just from there being too many damn people. So I do think that overpopulation is another issue like that, because it's like some people feel that they personally benefit from having like 10 children. Particularly people of non-Western backgrounds, to be honest. Like, let's be honest, those are the ones who tend to be having large families, who tend to be having high numbers of children. Whereas Western descended peoples do not tend to the same extent these days. Again, this would be an issue where like the left-right lines are kind of blurred, because in theory, some liberals might be against overpopulation, but they realize how fascist it sounds whenever the solutions are brought up. So there's actually been some flip-flopping on this issue, where I've seen left-wingers and right-wingers on each side of the issue making the individualist or collectivist arguments for it. So again, like that would definitely be another prisoner's dilemma issue. For similar reasons, resource depletion, like how much oil you use, how much energy you use, for tying into the same reasons as overpopulation and environmental issues, as I already mentioned. I believe I already touched on the migration and cultural change and how it affects this, and how sort of the left frames it as being beneficial to the collective, but it actually hurts the collective in many ways. But finally, okay, one final issue that I'll touch on that fits along these prisoner's dilemma lines is drug laws. Because with the libertarian perspective, the libertarians who support legalizing drugs, it's this idea like, well, as an individual, I'm a responsible person. I should be allowed to snort coke or, take mushrooms or whatever because I'm responsible enough to do it. That's their argument. Whereas from a collectivist perspective, it's like, okay, maybe you are responsible enough as an individual, or maybe you're just bullshitting. But either way, just because you're responsible enough doesn't change the fact that in the bigger picture, legalizing these drugs does more harm to society than it does good, because of all the people out there who can't handle these drugs, who can't handle the addictions and the problems that they cause. So this would definitely be a prisoner's dilemma issue along those lines, where of individual freedom versus what is better for the collective. So yeah, that about covers various issues that are framed along this way, and how basically libertarians, or perhaps right-wingers as a whole, support one stance which allegedly benefits the individual or benefits the nuclear family unit, whereas liberals or leftists, at least in theory, or socialists in theory, tend to support the ideas, the positions that allegedly benefit the community. Again, as I said, there's a lot of hypocrisy. There's a lot of issues where they frame it in this way, but it doesn't reflect the reality of the issue. But nonetheless, what I'm trying to say, my overall point here, is that it is interesting how right libertarians always go with the individual framing, whereas left socialists generally, although perhaps maybe slightly less consistently, but generally tend to go with what is the group, society, community, what is best for the whole orientation.